The advent of winter dampens the intensity of the military conflict, but the political action is as hot as ever. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal Pasha prepares his movement for the elections of the Ottoman Legislative Assembly and moves his seat of government to the city of Ankara. In Athens, Eleftheros Venizelos brings a first victory for the Greek nation with the Treaty of Neuilly. All this take place in November and December 1919 in this episode of Salvation and Catastrophe, the Greek-Turkish War of Anatolian Succession, 1919-1923. My name is Konstantinos Stavros and this is Salvation and Catastrophe. This episode will be uploaded in two parts, one covering the events of November 1919 and the other one covering the events of December 1919. So make sure to see both of them. They will be uploaded the same day. Before starting, I would like to encourage you to follow the Project History YouTube channel for interesting content in Greek about history and its many anecdotes. I would also like to encourage those of you who are war gamers, just like me, to check out the products of Iliada Games Studios. I'm not paid for these recommendations, it's just me helping friends around. Now, on with the episode. On 3rd November 1919, the Armenian Georgian Treaty of Arbitration and Transit Agreement is signed. This was something that had been mediated by the British following the border conflict over the area of Lori between the two young republics. In Western Asia Minor, General Milne permits the Greek army to conduct pursuit operations against the Kuvai Emilia, that is the Turkish nationalist guerrillas, up to a depth of 3 kilometers beyond the demarcation line. On 4th November 1919, there is a formal exchange of command in Cilicia, the area that is today Antalya of Turkey, between the Adana Correction, between British and French. French military forces, primarily made up of the Armenian Legion and colonial tirailleurs, begin occupying the Adana plain. The French also begin resettling Armenians who had survived the attempt at extermination by the Ottoman government of the Committee of Union and Progress, which is called the Armenian Genocide in most of the world. This puts at stake property ownership and leads to intercommunal fighting between the Muslims of the area and the returning Armenians. The focus of the conflict is going to be the mountain cities of Antep, later Gaziantep, and Maras, later Kahramanmaraş. Mustafa Kemal Pasha dispatched Emrul Hazade Asaf, known better as Kilich Ali, Sword Ali, to take command of the resistance. The Franco-Turkish War, aka the southern front of the Turkish War of Salvation, aka one of the wars of Anatolian succession, has now begun. Between the 4th and 23rd of November 1919, the Azeri Republic launches military operations to subjugate the Armenians of the Zangezur. These fail, and a truce is signed on November 23rd. On 7th November 1919, Greek troops begin taking control of Western Thrace in anticipation of the signing of the treaty between Bulgaria and the Entente forces. On 8th November 1919, in British India, the Muslim Indian Caliphate movement declares its support for the Turkish national movement under Mustafa Kemal Pasha. On 9th November 1919, the Minister of War of the Istanbul Ottoman Imperial Government, Cemal Pasha, asks the nationalist organizations not to interfere with governmental issues. Between 11th and 14th November 1919, there is a state visit to the United Kingdom by French President Raymond Poincaré and Foreign Minister Stéphane Pichon. On 12th November 1919, Mustafa Kemal Pasha openly denounces the French occupation of what they call Cilicia, but what for the Turks is the Adana region, and encourages resistance to those allied occupation forces, which, as we pointed out, are mostly the Armenian Legion and colonial French troops. Between 16th and 30th November 1919, we have the French legislative elections. there is a large swing to the political right, which is a major loss for French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. On 16 November 1919, we also have legislative elections in Italy. This time it is the left that wins, with the socialists coming first. At Siva, Sebastia, Mustafa Kemal Pasha meets with the commanders of the 15th, 2nd, 12th and 3rd Army Corps to discuss the issue of the meeting place of the Ottoman Parliament, for which elections are taking place while we're speaking. On 19th November 1919, the Versailles Treaty is rejected by the US Senate, signaling the end of the active involvement of the United States government in the peace negotiations. On 20th November 1919, there is an accord between Boghos Nubar, Hamazap Ohmadajian and Sherif Pasha on Kurdish-Armenian relations. On 21st November 1919, Curzon informs Nubar and Ahoronian that Cilicia will never be part of an Armenian state. The Armenians had asked that the new Armenian state include the 6 vilayets of Eastern Anatolia plus Cilicia, and those will be united with the existing Republic of Armenia in order to create a large Anatolian Armenian state that would essentially have a sea out into the Mediterranean. It is now clear that the English do not support that idea. On 22nd November 1919, General Anton Denikin, leader of the strongest white Russian forces that are available right now in the Russian Civil War, issues his declaration against the Republic of Azerbaijan, making clear that in case of victory of the white forces, Azerbaijan, as well as Georgia, will be reincorporated into the Russian state. Armenia is not a target of that declaration, and this is going to play a role in undermining any cooperation between the Caucasian republics. On 24th November 1919, there is a failure in negotiations for creation of a united government in Armenia. Until this point, the Armenian Republic government is mostly dominated by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or Danshakutian. I am not using those words well. There were attempts to include other Armenian parties, but those has failed. On 27th November 1919, Greek Prime Minister Eleftheros Venizelos publishes a letter addressed to Bulgarian Prime Minister Alexander Stambolinsky in reply to a previous letter that had been sent by Stambolinsky to Venizelos. Now, Stambolinsky, who had become Prime Minister of Bulgaria after the fall of the war government, had asked Venizelos to essentially give up Greek claims to the area of Western Thrace in order to essentially facilitate reconciliation between the Greek and the Bulgarian people, and thus build a stable peace in the Balkans. Venizelos was very clear that while he wished for a stable peace in the Balkans and a transformation of Greek-Bulgarian relations from that of rivalry to cooperation, it is impossible for Greece to give up its claims to Western Thrace. He argues that past attempts by him as Prime Minister of Greece to accommodate Bulgaria had always led to Bulgarian aggression. He refers in this case to the willingness of Greece to accept Bulgarian conquests during the First Balkan War. He refers in this case to his suggestion of giving the territory of Kavala, the city of Kavala, up to Bulgaria in return for a Bulgarian entering World War I on the side of the Entente. He says, every time I have been willing to accommodate you, the result has been an attack by Bulgaria against Greece. He also argues that Bulgaria has no national rights on the region, either due to population numbers, saying that the Bulgarians are a minority compared to the Greek and Muslim population, or due to history, basing his argument on the work of the Bulgarian historian Rizov, which shows that the areas of Western Thrace were only part of a Bulgarian state historically for a very tiny part of time in the medieval age. When Stambolinsky argues that Bulgaria needs an outlet to the Aegean and that's why it should get Western Thrace, he repeats his willingness as Greek Prime Minister to guarantee Bulgaria stable transit and commercial rights through Greece to the port of Kavala. Venizelos argues that the key to Balkan peace, or stable quality Balkan peace, is not any concessions by Greece to Bulgarian claims, but instead a fundamental change in the political culture of Bulgaria. Now, this is interesting, but this is a characteristic argument that Venizelos used when he faced political opponents who, like him during the war years, had taken a hardcore pro-Entente stance and had paid a price for it. In Bulgaria, Stambolinski had been put into prison for his opposition to an entry into the war, and he faced a similar opponent with Damat Ferit Pasha in Istanbul, Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire, who had gone to exile in 1913, again because of his opposition to the Committee of Union and Progress. Venizelos considered such politicians as very dangerous opponents, as they could furnish their own personal politics and the strategic realities to persuade major power decision makers to grant concessions to their states as a way of granting concessions to them. This was especially a dangerous risk with the United States of America. He believed that American friendliness and support for Bulgarian positions on the Western Thrace issue was all based on Americans' personal affinity for the face of Stambolinski. Venizelos countered this policy by arguing that these men were indeed to be thanked and honored for their activity in support of the Entente during the war, but that they were politically irrelevant within their countries, that they represented tiny political minorities that didn't have any real power. Venizelos argued, and will argue until his fall, and later on in November 1920, that both Stambolinski and Damat Ferit Pasha were really weak leaders who represented weak political minorities and were out of step with the majority public opinion in Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, and that this majority public opinion in both countries was dominated by essentially anti-Entente political forces. On the basis of this, he cautioned the major power decision makers against leniency based on favor for specific persons in power, and called for harshness until the public political culture in both countries had changed. For Venizelos, the end of the war had neither weakened the power of the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Committee, the VIRMO in Bulgaria, or the Committee of Union and Progress, the Ittihad Veteraki Cemiyeti in the Ottoman Empire. And because of that, there was the necessity for further weakening both states as a way to weaken both of these organizations. On that same day of his reply, the Treaty of Peace between Bulgaria and the Entente powers was signed at the suburb of Neuilly-sur-Seine of Paris. For Venizelos, this was an important development. The most relevant articles for Greece were that Bulgaria ceded Western Thrace to the Entente powers, who would then do whatever they wanted with it. Venizelos had strong promises from the United Kingdom and France that Greece would get the territory, and already the Greek army was in possession of it. So while Bulgaria did not cede the territory to its hated enemy, de facto essentially it did. Secondly, Bulgaria and Greece signed a voluntary population exchange treaty that would uproot a total of 60 to 65,000 people between the two states. And thirdly, importantly for Greece, the Bulgarian army was limited to a 20,000 man volunteer force. Now, these terms weakened Bulgaria as a state threat against Greece, but as we will see, it didn't dampen at all Venizelos' fears of the possibility of a Bulgarian-Ottoman alliance against Greece, as he didn't believe that the treaty did anything to weaken the all-powerful, in his eyes, VRMO within Bulgaria. This is going to play a role in his decision-making later on in 1920 when he's pursuing military operations against the nationalist Turkish movement. On 29th November 1919, the Siva Sevastia Generals Conference, this is the conference done between the various officers loyal to the national movement, ends. It is decided that A. Parliament will meet at Istanbul, B. The representative committee and its loyal officers will use all their power and influence to form a pro-Sivas group of parliamentarians before they went to Istanbul, Constantinople. C. The representative committee will continue to function away from Istanbul, Constantinople, establishing itself at the key city and logistical center of Eskişehir. The same day, on the 29th, the Azeri Ottoman governments signed a draft treaty which was never enacted. On 30th November 1919, George Picot departs for Anatolia to meet Mustafa Kemal Pasha Atatürk. This brings to an end our November 1919 episode, and now I will move on to the December 1919 episode.